The radio crackles. An officer's voice breaks through the static, urgent, strained, fearful. "Officer down! Shots fired!" Headlights flood the street. Patrol cars skid to a halt. Red and blue lights bleed into the night sky as chaos unfolds in a quiet Whittier neighborhood. A veteran police officer lies mortally wounded. Another is bleeding nearby. And somewhere in the darkness, the man responsible is still breathing. But this story does not begin here. To understand how a single night spiraled into one of Southern California's most controversial law enforcement homicides, we have to go back to East Los Angeles, to gang territory, and a man who carved his loyalty directly into his face, Michael Christopher Mejia. Known on the streets as Stomper, a hardcore member of the Winter Gardens gang. A man who would, in a matter of minutes, slaughter a family member, ignite a police ambush, and leave behind a trail of blood that would permanently scar California's criminal justice system. East Los Angeles is a place where gang identity is not just affiliation, it is inheritance. Neighborhood lines are drawn not on maps, but through generations of violence, loyalty, and fear. The Winter Gardens gang is one of those long-standing street crews, smaller than the infamous prison gangs, but no less entrenched in the culture of intimidation and retaliation. For members, there is no part-time commitment. You're either in or you're a target. Michael Mejia wasn't just associated. Authorities would later describe him as hardcore, a label reserved for individuals deeply embedded in gang life, men who enforce discipline, carry firearms, and represent their set at all costs. His face told the story before he ever spoke. A W tattooed on one cheek, a G tattooed on the other. Winter Gardens. Permanent branding, unavoidable, undeniable. These weren't prison tattoos hidden under clothing. They were declarations, statements to rivals, law enforcement, and the public that Mejia's allegiance was absolute, and his street name, Stomper, wasn't accidental. Names like that are earned through reputation, through violence, through a willingness to do what others won't. By 2017, Mejia was already a convicted felon. He was legally prohibited from possessing firearms. He was known to law enforcement, known to probation officers, known to the courts, and yet he was free. Under California's Assembly Bill 109, a realignment policy intended to reduce prison overcrowding, supervision of certain offenders shifted from state prisons to local probation departments. Mejia was one of those offenders. In the year leading up to the homicides, he had been jailed 5 separate times for probation violations. 5 warnings, 5 opportunities to escalate supervision, 5 chances to stop what was coming. Each time he returned to the streets. No intensive monitoring, no long-term custody, no removal from the environment that had shaped him. To critics, this would later become the heart of the controversy. A man with a history of violence, gang affiliation, and repeated violations, still walking free. To supporters of reform, it was not the law that failed, but the agencies responsible for enforcing it. Either way, the clock was ticking. On the surface, February 20th, 2017, appeared unremarkable. There were no warnings, no dramatic standoff, no high-speed chase. Just another day in East Los Angeles, until it wasn't. What unfolded next was not a spontaneous outburst, but a rapid escalation of violence, moving from personal conflict to public slaughter in a matter of minutes. But before the police ambush, before the radio calls, before Whittier became a crime scene, there was the first victim. A man named Roy Torres, 47 years old, a civilian. A man Mejia would later claim was his cousin. What happened between the two men in those final moments remains partly obscured, whether it was an argument, a grievance, or something more calculated. What is clear is the outcome. Roy Torres was slain by gunfire in East Los Angeles. No warning, no mercy. A homicide that would be overshadowed by what came next, but was no less final. In the aftermath, Mejia didn't flee on foot. He didn't hide. He escalated. He took Torres' car, and he drove. This is where the story crosses an invisible line. Up until this moment, the violence, however brutal, was still confined to a personal sphere, a domestic homicide, a familiar tragedy. But once Mejia entered that vehicle, armed and fleeing, the danger expanded outward to anyone who crossed its path. Minutes later, the stolen car crashed in Whittier, California. Police officers responded, believing they were walking into a routine crash scene. They were wrong. What awaited them was not an accident victim. It was an ambush. Officer Keith Boyer had spent 27 years serving the community. A veteran, a professional, a man nearing the end of a long career dedicated to public safety. Officer Patrick Hazel was there too, another responder doing his job. Neither knew that the man they were approaching had already committed homicide minutes earlier. Neither knew they were stepping into a lethal confrontation. As officers approached, Mejia opened fire. The gunshots shattered the night. Officer Boyer was struck and fatally wounded, slaughtered in the line of duty. Officer Hazel was hit as well, critically injured but alive. In seconds, a traffic response became one of the most devastating law enforcement homicides in recent Southern California history. Backup flooded the area. Mejia was eventually taken into custody. The violence stopped, but the consequences were just beginning. By sunrise, the story was everywhere. A gang member with face tattoos, a probationer, a convicted felon, a police officer slain. Questions exploded across newsrooms, police unions, city halls, and courtrooms. How was this man still free? Why wasn't he in custody? Who failed to intervene? For Officer Boyer's family, the questions were more personal. For Roy Torres' family, the loss was already fading into the background, overshadowed by the uniform, the badge, and the political firestorm to come. 2 lives ended. 1 man responsible. And a system forced into the spotlight. A gang identity etched into skin. A history of warnings ignored. A violent trajectory left uninterrupted. The stage is set. Because what happens next isn't just about 1 man, it's about a courtroom battle, a sentencing that would make headlines, and a criminal justice system put on trial alongside the accused. By the time the sun began to sink behind the sprawl of East Los Angeles, Michael Christopher Mejia was already in motion. Whatever had been building inside him, anger, paranoia, entitlement, or something darker, had reached a breaking point. This was not the reckless chaos of a man acting without direction. It was the deliberate movement of someone who believed consequences no longer applied to him. When Mejia encountered Roy Torres that day, the interaction did not end with raised voices or threats. It ended with gunfire. In a matter of seconds, Torres was slaughtered, his life extinguished in a burst of violence that left no room for explanation or reconciliation. Mejia would later claim Torres was his cousin, but blood relation offered no protection, no hesitation, no restraint. The homicide was swift, final, and utterly indifferent to the human cost. There was no panic afterward, no visible shock. Instead, there was efficiency. Mejia took Torres' vehicle as though it were simply another resource, another tool, and drove away from the scene, leaving behind a body and a community that would soon be overwhelmed by events far worse than anyone could have imagined. This moment marked the point of no return. The violence was no longer personal. It was mobile. Armed and fleeing, Mejia became a moving threat, a man carrying homicide forward with him as he crossed city lines. The drive into Whittier unfolded without interruption, without pursuit, without warning. To the outside world, nothing appeared unusual. A stolen vehicle blended into traffic. A convicted felon with a firearm remained invisible. When the car eventually crashed, it didn't raise immediate alarms beyond what any traffic collision would. Police were dispatched not to a manhunt, not to a homicide scene, but to what they believed was a routine call for service. The officers responding had no reason to believe they were walking into an ambush. They were doing what they had done countless times before, approaching a crashed vehicle, assessing the situation, prepared to help or investigate. What they encountered instead was a man who had already crossed every line. As officers moved toward the scene, Mejia did not surrender. He did not flee on foot. He did not comply. He opened fire. The gunshots were sudden, violent, and merciless, ripping through the quiet street and instantly transforming it into a battlefield. Officer Keith Boyer was struck and went down, his decades of service ending in seconds. A 27-year veteran, a husband, a public servant, slain where he stood. Officer Patrick Hazel was also hit. Wounded in the barrage, his survival owed only to chance and immediate medical intervention. This was no exchange of fire. This was not confusion. It was a deliberate act of lethal aggression against uniformed officers performing their duties. In that moment, the situation escalated from homicide to something far larger. This was no longer just the slaughter of a civilian. It was an assault on the authority of the state itself. The radio calls that followed were frantic, overlapping, desperate. Officers flooded the area, weapons drawn, adrenaline surging, fully aware that one of their own had been cut down. Streets were locked down. Helicopters circled overhead. What had begun as a single act of violence in East Los Angeles had now detonated into a region-wide emergency. Mejia was eventually taken into custody, alive. The gunfire stopped, but the damage could not be undone. Officer Boyer was pronounced dead, his loss reverberating far beyond Whittier. Law enforcement agencies across California mourned, while the public struggled to comprehend how a man on probation, prohibited from possessing a firearm, had managed to carry out such devastation. The narrative quickly crystallized. A gang member, already known to the system, had been allowed to remain free long enough to slaughter a civilian and slay a police officer within the span of minutes. As details emerged, the timeline became more disturbing, not less. Now, this wasn't an isolated lapse or a single missed appointment. Mejia had cycled through probation custody repeatedly in the year before the homicides, jailed and released over and over again without meaningful escalation. Each return to the streets reinforced the same message, that no matter how often he violated the terms of his release, the system would absorb the risk. On February 20th, 2017, that risk was paid in blood. For the families of the victims, the questions were unbearable. For Officer Boyer's loved ones, the grief was inseparable from anger. For Roy Torres' family, the loss was quieter, already fading from headlines dominated by police funeral and political statements. 2 lives had ended violently, yet only one would come to define the case in the public eye. The day closed with vigils, press conferences, and outrage, but also with an uncomfortable truth. The violence had not come from nowhere. It had been building in plain sight. By nightfall, Michael Christopher Mejia sat in custody, the face tattoos that once signaled dominance, now serving as unmistakable identifiers of a man accused of unprecedented brutality. The Winter Garden's insignia, etched into his skin, no longer represented loyalty or strength. It symbolized a path that led inevitably to lifelong confinement. The bloodshed was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. Because what followed would not only determine Mejia's fate, it would ignite a legal and political battle over responsibility, reform, and whether California's justice system had failed to stop a man who was clearly unraveling. The courtroom was quieter than the streets Christopher Mejia had left behind, but the stakes were no less severe. Where sirens and gunfire once dominated, there were now legal arguments, evidentiary exhibits, and a jury tasked with reconstructing a day of bloodshed piece by piece. Mejia sat at the defense table, his face tattoos still visible, still declaring Winter Garden's loyalty, even as the consequences of that identity closed in around him. The prosecution did not present him as a man who simply snapped. They presented him as a known danger, someone whose trajectory had been documented, warned against, and yet repeatedly ignored. Jurors heard how Mejia had been legally barred from possessing a firearm, how his probation status placed him under supervision, and how despite multiple violations, he had been returned to the streets time and again. This was not a case built solely on the events of February 20th, 2017. It was a narrative of escalation, of missed intervention, and of a system that failed to contain a man who was clearly unraveling. The homicides were the climax, not the beginning. Testimony detailed the slaughter of Roy Torres in East Los Angeles, followed by the carjacking that carried violence into Whittier. Prosecutors walked the jury through the ambush, step by step, emphasizing that Officer Keith Boyer had no opportunity to retreat, no warning that the man in front of him had already committed homicide. The act was framed as intentional, calculated, and utterly indifferent to human life. The wounding of Officer Patrick Hazel further underscored the indiscriminate nature of the attack. Anyone in range was a target. The defense offered little in the way of denial. The facts were overwhelming. Instead, arguments centered on Mejia's mental state, his upbringing, and the systemic conditions that had shaped him. But those arguments collided with the physical evidence, the ballistics, the eyewitness accounts, and the devastating clarity of the timeline. The jury was not being asked to speculate. They were being asked to judge responsibility. In September 2021, the verdict came back, guilty on all major counts. 2 counts of first-degree homicide, attempted homicide, carjacking, possession of a firearm by a felon. Jurors also found special circumstances to be true, including the slaying of a peace officer, an aggravating factor that elevated the case into the most severe category under California law. The courtroom absorbed the decision in silence. For Mejia, the path forward narrowed to a single question: how much of his life would be taken in return for the lives he had ended? Yet even as the legal outcome appeared clear, the case detonated into a broader political and ideological conflict. Prosecutors had initially sought the death penalty, a move that reflected the unprecedented nature of the violence and the symbolic weight of Officer Boyer's death. But in 2021, that request was withdrawn under the administration of Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon, whose office had committed to sweeping reforms, including opposition to capital punishment. The decision ignited outrage among law enforcement organizations and victims' advocates who argued that withdrawing the death penalty sent the wrong message in a case involving the deliberate slaying of a police officer. Reform advocates countered that capital punishment was inconsistent with a justice system focused on accountability rather than retribution. The courtroom became a stage for a much larger debate, one that extended far beyond Michael Mejia. At the center of that debate was Assembly Bill 109, the realignment law that had placed Mejia under local probation instead of state prison supervision. Critics argued that the policy had created cracks wide enough for violent offenders to slip through, allowing a man with repeated violations to remain free until he committed irreversible acts. Supporters insisted the law itself was not to blame, pointing instead to failures by probation officers and prosecutors who had not sought enhanced supervision or revocation despite clear warning signs. The truth, as it often is, lay somewhere in between. Mejia had been given chances, more than most. He had been jailed repeatedly, released repeatedly, and returned to the same environment that reinforced his violent identity. Each decision, viewed in isolation, may have seemed reasonable. Together, they formed a chain of inaction that culminated in slaughter. By the time sentencing approached, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted again. This was no longer about guilt. It was about reckoning. Families of the victims sat just feet away from the man responsible for their loss. Uniformed officers filled the gallery in silent solidarity. The question before the court was not whether Mejia had committed these acts, but whether the system would respond with its full weight. Because whatever sentence was imposed would not only define the rest of Mejia's life, it would signal how California responded when reform, supervision, and public safety collided with catastrophic results. The courtroom was filled when Michael Christopher Mejia returned for sentencing, but the energy was different now. The tension of uncertainty had been replaced by the gravity of finality. There would be no more arguments about what happened, no more debate over responsibility. The facts were settled. 2 lives had been erased through deliberate acts of violence, and the law was now prepared to respond with its harshest consequences, short of execution. Mejia stood before the bench not as a gang figure or street presence, but as a man facing the permanent weight of his own actions. Judge Roger Ito spoke deliberately, his words cutting through the silence with precision. He described Mejia's conduct as displaying an extraordinary level of callousness, emphasizing the complete absence of remorse shown throughout the proceedings. This was not a momentary lapse, the court made clear, but a sustained pattern of disregard for human life that culminated in catastrophic loss. The slaughter of Roy Torres and the slaying of Officer Keith Boyer were not isolated tragedies. They were the final outcomes of a violent trajectory left unchecked for far too long. The sentence reflected that assessment. 2 terms of life without the possibility of parole were imposed, 1 for each homicide, ensuring that Mejia would never again walk free. On top of that came an additional 100 to 15 years to life, plus 34 years and 4 months for related crimes including attempted homicide, carjacking, and firearm possession. It was the maximum sentence available under California law, a judicial declaration that Mejia's presence in society posed an unacceptable risk. For the families of the victims, the sentence offered a form of closure, but not peace. No number of years could restore what had been taken. Officer Boyer's legacy was honored through ceremony and remembrance, his decades of service etched into departmental history and collective memory. His death became a symbol, cited in policy debates and reform arguments, his name invoked whenever discussions of probation failures and public safety arose. Roy Torres, by contrast, received far less attention. His life, though no less valuable, faded more quickly from public discourse, a reminder that civilian victims are often overshadowed when law enforcement is among the slain. Mejia himself was transferred into the state prison system, where his gang tattoos, once symbols of dominance, now marked him as permanently identifiable, permanently confined. The Winter Garden's insignia on his face no longer commanded fear. It ensured isolation. His world narrowed to concrete, steel, and routine. The rest of his life measured not in years, but in repetition. Whatever power he once believed he held vanished the moment the cell door closed behind him. Yet the case did not end with his incarceration. It continued to reverberate through California's criminal justice system, fueling debates that remain unresolved. Critics of realignment policies pointed to Mejia as proof that reform had gone too far, that dangerous individuals had been allowed to remain free until tragedy forced action. Reform advocates responded that the failure was not philosophical, but operational, that laws designed to reduce incarceration were undermined by inconsistent enforcement and inadequate supervision. The truth was uncomfortable for all sides. Warning signs had been present, and intervention had not come in time. In the end, the story of Michael Christopher Mejia is not just the story of one man's descent into violence. It is the story of how identity, environment, and institutional decisions intersect with irreversible consequences. A gang allegiance carved into skin became a life sentence carved into law. A series of overlooked violations became a chain of events ending in slaughter. And a system built to balance reform and safety was forced to confront the cost of getting that balance wrong. The streets of East Los Angeles and Whittier returned to normal in the months that followed. Traffic resumed. Patrol cars answered new calls. Life moved forward. But beneath that surface calm, the impact remained, carried by families who would never be whole again, and by a justice system forever marked by a case that asked a question with no easy answer. Could this have been stopped? Michael Christopher Mejia will spend the rest of his life behind bars. That much is certain. What remains uncertain is whether the lessons of his case will prevent the next tragedy, or whether somewhere else the same warnings are already being ignored.